Welcome to Common Myths and Mix-Ups, Accessible Parking. It's my pleasure to introduce our speaker for today, my coworker, colleague, guru of the ADA and everything related to it, Nancy Horton. She is the Associate Director of the Mid-Atlantic ADA Center, and I'm going to turn the presentation over to her at this time. Take it away, Nancy.
Thanks. Thanks so much, Jen, and thank all of you for joining us today. And we're going to jump right into our topic of the day and talk about accessible parking. This is our agenda for today. We're going to talk a little bit about Title II and Title III of the ADA, which is where the ADA standards for facility accessibility live. We're going to talk a little bit about parking in the public right-of-way, parking on state or local government streets and roads. We're going to talk a little bit about a few situations where parking might need to be provided or reserved as a form of individualized accommodation. And we're going to touch just a bit on state and local law and how that can affect issues around accessible parking. So let's just jump right in with a few common myths to get us started with our debunking. These are a few common myths that we sometimes encounter. Myth, the ADA applies to all buildings in the United States. Myth, parking must be provided for people with disabilities, even where parking is not provided at all. Myth, people with disabilities who have accessible parking permits are allowed to park in any space designated as accessible and cannot be subject to any parking restrictions, such as time limits or customers only. So these are all some myths that we sometimes encounter. So let's talk a little bit about where and how the ADA does apply to parking. So first of all, the ADA applies where parking is provided for employees and or visitors. That might mean customers, clients, patients, what have you, where parking is provided by state or local government agencies, which are covered by Title II of the ADA, or by public accommodations or commercial facilities, which are covered by Title III. Now, public accommodations include a variety of private businesses that offer goods and services to the general public. All kinds of stores and restaurants and movie theaters and the offices of professionals like real estate agents and lawyers and doctors and all kinds of agencies that offer goods or services to the general public. Commercial facilities are private businesses that operate places like warehouses and factories, places that are not open to the public. Now, all of these types of facilities have to meet ADA accessibility standards when they build things new, when they do new construction. When they undergo planned alterations, buildings must meet ADA standards to the greatest extent that's technically feasible. So there might be limitations based on existing conditions of a site or a facility, but generally they have to meet standards to the greatest extent possible. Now we have two accessibility standards under Titles II and III of the ADA. One is from the Department of Transportation and applies to transportation facilities such as bus stops, train stations, and so forth. And then we have a standard from the U.S. Department of Justice, which addresses all the other types of facilities that are covered under either of these titles. Now, the two standards are very, very similar, and there are really no distinctions that really affect what we're going to be talking about today. But I just want folks to know that there are these two standards. So on slide 14 here, the ADA standards And these links are live in the handouts that you can download from our website. This link is to a version of the ADA standards at the U.S. Access Board's website. And this version combines the two standards, Department of Justice and Department of Transportation standards, into one document. So you can find this here. You'll find the scoping provisions for parking, which is where we find out how many parking spaces in a particular parking facility need to be accessible, as well as the technical specifications, which is what does an accessible parking space look like? What features does it have to have? So that's Section 208 and Section 502 of the standards. So, what about existing facilities that aren't undergoing alterations? This is where the ADA and the two titles address accessibility a little bit differently. So, under Title II, state and local governments have this obligation known as program accessibility, which means they need to ensure that people with disabilities can have access to and participate in the programs, services, and activities that the public entity offers, makes available. Whatever programs people are eligible to participate in, they should be able to participate in. And that may mean making structural improvements in older buildings at some times. Now, under Title III, it's a little bit different. Public accommodations, those types of private businesses that offer goods and services to the public, have to engage in what we call readily achievable barrier removal, which means they need to take proactive steps to improve accessibility in older buildings to the extent that the existing conditions of the site and the structure allow, and considering cost factors. So, cost is a factor here, unlike it in construction or alterations. Now, commercial facilities, the warehouses and the factories and so forth, have no obligation to improve access in existing buildings that are not undergoing alterations. So it's a different type of obligation here in these commercial facilities because they have no customers going in there. So, scoping. This is what we call it when we're trying to figure out what kinds of spaces or elements need to be accessible, how many need to be accessible. We call this scoping. So this table that you see here is, you'll find this in the standards. This is how we figure that out for parking spaces. It goes by the total number of parking spaces in a particular parking facility, be it a lot, garage, structure, what have you. So in this left-hand column, you find these numbers that refer to the total number of spaces. In the center column, you'll find how many total accessible spaces are needed. And in the column on the right, how many of those accessible spaces need to be van accessible. There's a certain number until you get to larger facilities, and then you'll notice that it sort of changes the way we figure this out. The number of van accessible spaces is always one of every 6 or fraction of 6 of the accessible spaces. So we have this example here on the right. Say we have a parking lot with 350 total spaces. We're going to find that on our table. We're going to look and see we need a total of 8 accessible spaces, 2 of which need to be van accessible, and 6 need to be standard accessible spaces. So that's our basic scoping for most types of facilities. Now on slide 16, certain types of medical facilities need more accessible parking. Outpatient facilities that are located in hospitals need to provide 10% of their patient and visitor spaces accessible. Outpatient physical therapy facilities and rehabilitation facilities that specialize in treating conditions that affect mobility need to provide 20% of those patient and visitor spaces. The van accessible requirements are the same. It's all 1 out of 6 or fraction of 6 of the accessible spaces must be van accessible. Now on slide 17, there are a few exceptions. Parking spaces that are used exclusively for buses, trucks, other delivery vehicles, law enforcement vehicles, or vehicular impound are not required to provide accessible spaces. As long as any of those parking facilities that are accessed by the public, for example, an impound lot, have an accessible passenger loading zone. So if you do get your car towed and you have to go to the impound to retrieve it, at least there should be an accessible passenger loading zone there. Now on slide 18, when we talk about scoping, we really want to underscore that scoping is applied for each separate parking facility on a site. So on this slide, we have this image that sort of illustrates that concept for us. We're looking at this large building on this site. Behind the building, it has a parking structure. Directly in front of the building, right next to the front of the building, is a small parking lot. And then further away, with a separate vehicular entrance from the main road, is a larger parking lot. So this particular site has 3 separate parking facilities, a structure and 2 separate lots, and scoping needs to be applied to each of the 3 separately based on the total number of spaces in each. So sometimes it's pretty clear, like the image on that last slide is pretty clear for us to see that there are 3 separate parking facilities, but sometimes it's not quite as clear, and we have to look a little more closely to determine, are lots or parking facilities separate? Are they shared? And so the image on this slide shows us an example of that. We've got this site that has a shopping mall right in the middle with a big parking lot that kind of goes all around it and is on all sides. Over on the bottom right side of that image, there's a separate building, but which is also served by that same large parking lot that surrounds the mall in the middle. And then over on the left-hand side, there's another outbuilding, a small building that is got some structural elements that separate it from the parking lot that surrounds the mall. It's got a separate entrance from the road to that parking lot that is dedicated to serving that one small facility. And so that lot is separate. These factors on this slide are factors that can help us determine if something is a separate lot versus a shared lot. It's a different type of structure. For example, a surface lot as opposed to a garage. It's separated by streets, roads, guardrails, fences, or other barriers, not just drive aisles or landscaping within something like we're looking at here. Or it's dedicated to serving a separate building or facility. So in this image, in this example, this large lot that serves both the mall in the center, which has multiple entrances, and the building in the right side, all those entrances in both those buildings are served by one lot. So that lot needs to be scoped. How many spaces do we need? And those spaces need to be dispersed around the lot in locations that give people access to the different buildings and the different entrances, where the small parcel on the left needs to be scoped separately, and those accessible spaces located on the shortest accessible route to that entrance of that small building. So on slide 20 here, we have a little bit of the flip side of that sort of situation. In some situations, we have one big lot serving multiple buildings or multiple entrances, but sometimes we have multiple parking facilities serving the same building or entrance. So in a case like that, you can sometimes group accessible spaces in one parking facility, in one location, if a couple of things are in place. If equivalent or better access will result from that in terms of factors like distance to entrances, parking fees, conveniences like protection from the weather, security, lighting, things like that. And as long as the number of accessible spaces is scoped first according to the separate parking facilities. You always have to apply scoping to each separate parking facility and then combine the number of accessible spaces required. So on our next slide, number 21, we have an example to sort of illustrate this. So let's say a performance venue, a theater, has a surface parking lot adjacent to the theater. It's right next to the theater with 100 total parking spaces. They have another surface lot, very similar, across the street with 500 additional spaces. So we apply our scoping to each lot separately. The adjacent lot needs a total of 4 accessible spaces, 3 standard and 1 van accessible. The lot across the street requires 9 accessible spaces, 7 standard and 2 van accessible. So in order to provide better access in terms of a shorter travel distance to the entrance for customers, we can combine the numbers of accessible spaces required in the 2 lots and provide those in the lot adjacent to the theater and put no accessible spaces in the lot across the street. Now we want to touch a little bit on garages and structures because it is a little different in those environments where you have multi-level garages or structures that have direct connections to the facility that the parking serves. Then accessible spaces need to be dispersed on the different levels. However, van accessible spaces may be grouped on one level, and typically you'll see this as the ground level or the level closest to the ground in something like an underground garage because van spaces need to have a certain vertical clearance, a certain height clearance in height to accommodate these taller, higher vehicles. And so you're allowed to group those van spaces on one level so that you don't necessarily have to provide that much vertical clearance to all the other levels. Now, when you have a garage or a structure that does not serve a specific facility, your typical downtown garage where you just go and, pay to park for a couple of hours or a day, and you're just going to maybe multiple locations in the area, then the accessible spaces should be located on the shortest accessible route to the pedestrian entrance, to an accessible pedestrian entrance of the parking facility. Because in this type of facility, that's where you're going, right? You're just going out into the community. Slide 23, location, location, location. We're really talking about the spaces now. This is another common myth that we tend to encounter. The myth is that accessible parking spaces must be the ones located nearest to the entrance. And this is not really quite accurate. Actually, accessible spaces need to be located so that they connect to the shortest accessible route to the entrance or facility served. You've kind of heard me say that a couple of times, the shortest accessible route. It's really about the route. And this image on this slide illustrates this concept nicely. We're looking at the front of a building, and there are some parking spaces, some perpendicular parking spaces kind of lined up in front of the sidewalk, in front of this building. And we see the entrance down at the right side of this image. And there are about 6 or 7 steps to get up to this entrance. So that is going to require this long ramp to be able to have an accessible route, because steps are not an accessible route. So the accessible parking spaces are located near the bottom of the ramp. There are non-accessible parking spaces closer to the entrance, as the crow flies, so to speak. But since stairs are not an accessible route, it doesn't help people with disabilities to put an accessible space right in front of the door if they have to get out of their vehicle, travel down the sidewalk to get to the bottom of the ramp, and then back up the ramp to get back in front of the door. So it's really all about locating those spaces um, along a route so people can get where they're going. We want to say a word about passenger loading zones. There's a little bit of relationship sometimes with accessible parking and passenger loading zones. There are only a few types of facilities where the ADA standards require that a passenger loading zone be provided. One type is licensed medical care and long-term care facilities. Another is valet parking service facilities need to provide a passenger loading zone, an accessible passenger loading zone. Now, accessible parking spaces are still required in these parking facilities when they're located right there on the same site where the valet service is being provided. Those accessible spaces still need to be there to accommodate individuals who may have adapted vehicles that cannot be driven by a valet. And those folks need to be able to self-park. Another type of facility that requires an accessible passenger loading zone are mechanical access parking garages, like we see in this image here, this sort of, vehicle vending machine. Accessible spaces are not required in that type of parking facility, but a passenger loading zone is. Where covered entities choose to provide passenger loading zones, then at least one must be accessible. For every continuous 100 linear feet or fraction thereof within the loading zone space. So performance theaters and places like this that just provide a passenger loading zone, they do need to include accessibility. Now, on slide 25, we're going to just talk a little bit about the technical specifications, the features that accessible parking spaces need to have. They need to be located on stable, firm, essentially level surfaces. Spaces need to be marked. They need to have, markings on the pavement. They need to have certain minimum widths. Standard accessible spaces need to be at least 96 inches or 8 feet wide. Van accessible spaces, 132 inches or 11 feet wide. Each space must have an adjacent access aisle at least 60 inches, that's 5 feet, and marked to discourage parking in the aisle. Now, two accessible spaces can share an aisle between them, except for angled van accessible spaces. Each of those type has to have an aisle on the passenger side. Now, I alluded to this a little earlier. Van accessible spaces, the access aisles that go with them, and the vehicular routes that go to and from them must have at least 98 inches of vertical clearance to accommodate those taller vehicles. And parking areas need to be designed so that parked vehicles don't block adjacent accessible routes. So sometimes you might need parking stops so that vehicles don't overlap the sidewalk when they pull up, or things of that nature. Now, on slide 26, if you would like to have your van accessible spaces have a wider aisle as opposed to having a wider space, it's allowed under the standards. And instead of having an 11-foot space with a 5-foot aisle, you can have an 8-foot space with an 8-foot aisle. The total space is the same. It's just a different configuration. Now, on slide 27, accessible parking spaces need to be designated with signs that include the International Symbol of Accessibility, or ISA. Those signs need to be mounted at least 60 inches to the bottom of the sign, measured from the ground surface. Signs for van spaces need to include the phrase van accessible. They need to be designated as such. They're not reserved only for the use of vans, but they need to be designated. There are a couple of exceptions just for the sign requirement. This is not an exception from providing accessible parking spaces, just for having a sign. And this includes lots with a total of 4 or fewer spaces, like this small building that we see in this image on the slide, or residential facilities where parking spaces are assigned to specific units. Residential facilities on slide 28. Here's another myth that we tend to encounter. The myth being that all residential facilities are covered by the ADA. This is really not quite right. Title II of the ADA covers public housing that's provided by state or local governments. Title III, the title that covers private businesses, many types of private businesses, only covers housing if it is sort of a component of a program or service of a public accommodation. So some examples here: an assisted living facility, a college dormitory, a recovery home, places that, they're providing healthcare services, education, social services. Those kinds of services are what make those places covered under Title III. So the housing is sort of a component of that. But your typical private, strictly residential facilities, like your typical apartment complexes and condominium communities and things, are not covered by the ADA. Many of them are covered by the Fair Housing Act. The Fair Housing Act is not our area of expertise, but it covers a lot of private housing, which the ADA does not. The Fair Housing Act was in place and had protections for people with disabilities before the ADA was passed. So for the type of residential facilities that are covered by the ADA on slide 29, parking is addressed a little bit differently than the other types of typical facilities. So where at least one parking space is provided for each dwelling unit, at least one accessible parking space is required for each mobility accessible dwelling unit. If the total number of resident parking spaces is fewer than the number of units, then you revert back to that general scoping table that we looked at earlier. Where more than one space is provided for each dwelling unit, 2%, no fewer than one, of the additional spaces above and beyond the one per dwelling unit must also be accessible. And if there's parking that's provided for non-residents, visitors, employees, what have you, then again, you follow the general scoping table for those spaces. So now on slide 30, I want to just touch a little bit on parking in the public right-of-way. So this is going to be relevant for state and local governments that provide parking on their public roads or streets. The U.S. Access Board has final guidelines for accessibility in the public right-of-way. The U.S. Department of Transportation just very, very recently adopted those guidelines as standards for their ADA standards. The Department of Justice has not done that yet, but a lot of state and local government entities follow the guidelines, which provide really excellent direction to ensure that people with disabilities have access to on-street parking. So scoping and technical specifications are different in the public right-of-way. You do scope according to the total number of spaces where parking is provided on a street. It's either metered or it's designated by signs or pavement markings. And if individual spaces aren't marked somehow, then you count each 20 feet of the street or the block perimeter where parking is designated as a space. Again, we have a couple of exceptions here for parking that's restricted to residential use or for commercial or law enforcement vehicles. Now, this is a table for scoping for on-street parking in the public right-of-way. It's a little different from what we see for sites that we've been looking at up to this point. So you look at a different table when you're looking at on-street parking. We're also looking at a little bit of different technical specifications. On slide 33 here, we have a couple of images that illustrate parallel parking spaces on street. They have to be at least 24 feet long and 13 feet wide. They have to have a connection, a curb ramp or something, to the pedestrian route to get up on the sidewalk. And the center 50% of that length of that space needs to be free of obstructions, needs to be clear. No signs, no street furniture, plantings, or anything, because some people with disabilities may need to deploy their ramps or their lifts out of their vehicles literally onto that space. Now, when we have parallel parking on street in existing streetscapes and we're doing alterations, we have some allowances for that. Where the parking spaces are being altered, which could be even restriping, resurfacing, restriping, things of that nature. And the pedestrian area is not being altered, or we're providing for the full dimension of an accessible space, like we looked at on the previous slide, would result in narrowing that adjacent right-of-way to 9 feet or less. Then the accessible spaces can have the same dimensions as any other space on the street, any other parking space. But the accessible spaces need to be located nearest to and connected to a crosswalk, either at the end of a block or a mid-block, so that people can have access to a curb ramp or a blended transition or someplace where they can, again, have access to the pedestrian way to get up on the sidewalk. So on slide 35, if we have perpendicular parking on street, which you see occasionally, we have different dimensions. Access aisles need to be 96 inches wide minimum when we have perpendicular on-street parking. 2 accessible spaces can share an aisle between them if you can either pull in forward or backward into the parking space. But if parking is restricted to only front or rear entry and the access aisle is serving one parking space, it has to be on the passenger side of the vehicle, which is more often where people who have vehicle mounted lifts or ramps is usually on the passenger side. Now, angled parking on street, which you tend to see this a little more commonly than perpendicular, is again, it's a little different. The width of any angled parking space must be at least 132 inches, and each space must have its own access aisle on the passenger side, at least 60 inches wide minimum. So again, I'm throwing a lot at you. I'm throwing a lot of numbers. You don't need to try to remember all this. It's all in your handouts and you can look all of this up, but I just want to kind of get a little bit of awareness level of some of these distinctions. So we also want to sort of remind folks that both Title II and Title III of the ADA specifically address obligations for covered entities to maintain features that are required to be accessible, all features. And this includes accessible parking. Where accessible parking is required, it needs to be maintained. So that means, it might mean that missing or faded signs need to be replaced, faded pavement markings need to be repainted, surfaces need to be kept in good repair, they need to be kept clear of snow, ice, all of these sorts of things. We don't want to see snow literally piled into and plowed into the accessible space, or all of the spring bedding plants and topsoil piled into the accessible parking spaces, things of that nature. It's all about maintaining accessibility. It doesn't help people with disabilities to have an accessible parking space with the aisle and the markings and the sign and everything's there like we see here, but all the snow has been plowed into it, so it's blocked. It's no good. So on slide 38, we want to move on and talk just a little bit about a couple of situations where we might need to see some more individualized approach, literally, to parking under the ADA, or in some cases, the Fair Housing Act. So on slide 39, Title 1 of the ADA addresses employment. It covers certain employers. And this is a myth that we hear a lot. We hear this a lot. Our work site has the minimum number of accessible parking spaces required by the ADA standards in our employee parking lot, so we're in compliance with providing parking for our employees. And again, not quite right. That's good as far as it goes, but employers that are covered by Title 1 of the ADA must provide individualized reasonable accommodations to workers with disabilities. And this could mean, in some cases, reserving parking spaces for individual workers, increasing the number of accessible spaces in a particular facility, or other measures that ensure access for employees with disabilities. Sometimes in situations like this, individuals could be accommodated with a reserved space that's not even an accessible space like what we've been talking about. Some people with disabilities need accessible parking because they have heart conditions or lung conditions, their ability to walk long distances is limited, things of that nature. They can be accommodated by just a regular space that's near an entrance. So reasonable accommodations in employment are different. It's a different issue. It's an additional issue under the ADA. And somewhat similarly, we often see under Title II of the ADA, as well as the Fair Housing Act, where state or local governments provide on-street parking, parking in the public right-of-way in residential areas so that people can, park near their homes. And so these entities may need to consider designating accessible spaces or reserving spaces to ensure that residents with disabilities can have an equal opportunity to gain access to their homes. So on slide 41, again, this sort of circles us back to the Fair Housing Act again. So those private residential facilities that are not covered by the ADA, your typical apartment complexes and so forth, the Fair Housing Act, where it applies, does require also individualized reasonable accommodations to ensure access for residents with disabilities. Reasonable accommodations under the Fair Housing Act are individualized adjustments in rules, policies, or practices. So, for example, at an apartment complex with a parking lot where spaces are generally unassigned, it might be necessary to assign a parking space to a specific resident with a disability. So we just sort of wanted to get that on people's radar as well. There are some unique settings where parking can literally be more of an individualized accommodation, as opposed to, you're just going to a public place and we're just looking at a standard. So as we wrap up, we want to remind folks, I think most people know this, but getting an accessible parking permit is not something to do with the ADA. It's states that issue accessible parking permits, and territories, the District of Columbia, and so forth. This is where you get your accessible parking permit. And this is also where illegal parking, use of permits, all of that is addressed under state or local law. So people who are parking in an accessible space who don't have a permit, or they're using a grandmother's permit, or something like that, or they're not eligible to park in that space. It's a space that's posted customers, for this restaurant only. And, somebody parks there and goes across the street to the beach for the day, and, they're going to get their car towed, things of that nature. Those are all really state and local law issues. Also, states and localities sometimes have more specific or more stringent requirements related to accessible parking spaces. Like in this image here, we see some parking spaces. They've got the ISA not only on signs posted at the head of the spaces, they've got pavement markings with the ISA painted on the ground. The spaces are marked with blue paint. That might be a state or local requirement. Again, the ADA says the space needs to be marked. The dimensions need to be marked, that the widths needs to be marked. They need to have signs at the head, with the ISA in front of the space. It could be on a wall, it could be on a post, but it just has to have the ISA. But some places require that the penalty be posted, the fine to notify people. If you park here illegally, you might get a $250 fine, what have you. So it's really important to know, especially if you're a business and you're about to restripe your parking lot or something, you really need to make sure that you check on a very local level to make sure that you comply not only with the ADA, but to any state or local requirements that might apply. And so with that is our sort of broad brush overview of accessible parking. And so I think we do have time for a couple of questions, if we have any questions.
We do have some questions, Nancy, in the chat, so I'm going to go through some of them for you if that would be okay.
Sure, we'll see if we can't answer them.
I'm going to go from the ones that were put in earlier in the presentation and work my way down. So when two parking spaces share an access aisle, does each space require a sign? Each space does have the symbol painted on the asphalt.
Well, the paint, the thing on the asphalt doesn't meet the ADA requirements. I think there is some debate about whether you could post signs that say, from here to there, kinds of signs. The standards, aren't as clear as we might like, but they do sort of indicate that each space needs to have a sign, needs to be designated by an above grade sign that includes the international symbol of accessibility.
Great. Danielle, I see that you raised your hand. If you want to unmute and ask your question, that's great.
I'm not sure if participants can do that, Jen. Not sure if they can unmute
Okay.
themselves.
Can you hear me?
Yep, there you go.
Thank you. I figured this might be faster than typing. I guess it's a two-part question. If I do see something kind of in the immediate, like say for your example, your picture of the parking space with the snow pile up, or maybe being used as a loading dock, if I see something in the moment, how or who should I report that to so it can be mediated quicker?
Well, I mean, my first suggestion would be the entity, the store or the, whatever, to alert them that, because they should be concerned about that. It's an accessibility issue. It's a customer service issue. It's an issue, and they should be concerned about that. Now, it could be an ADA issue, but the ADA is not like the police, right? They don't come right out. You can file an ADA complaint against a state or local government agency or a public accommodation, for example, if you believe that they are not maintaining their accessible features. And particularly if you see it sort of happening routinely, um, filing ADA complaints or lawsuits or something obviously takes time. But it is an ADA requirement to that maintenance piece.
Thank you. That's very helpful because I see it quite often and I just go, what what do I do about this? And the second part to my question is if I see older outdated signs that say handicap parking, or I've seen it with like push button that opens doors and they say like for handicap use only. Is there a way that I can tell someone or that they can change it so it says accessible? Or once, I mean, that's the sign, that's what it's going to be there forever, sort of thing?
Well, it's not a requirement. It's not something that you can say that the ADA prohibits that language. It doesn't. But certainly, again, you can advocate, you can encourage, you can request that language be updated. Recognize, it's very common. People using that term, it's very, very common, including people with disabilities use that term. We don't use it. We discourage the use of it. We say, we think it's better to say accessible. But it's really kind of again, it's an awareness issue. It's sort of an education issue. It's a bit, we sometimes tell covered entities, like I said, it's not prohibited. And you will hear people with disabilities use it, but at the same time, some people find it offensive. So why use terminology that, some people find offensive, right?
Okay, I'm going to read some more questions. And I do want to remind everybody, because we won't have time to get to all of these questions. There's some really good questions in the chat and in the Q&A that you can always call the ADA Center, the Mid-Atlantic ADA Center, or the Mid-Atlantic the regional center that you are connected to, and ask questions about these kinds of parking things too. So I'm going to keep on reading, but keep that in mind. You can always give us a call or
Yeah,
send us
give
an
us a
email.
call.
Can a Title III organization provide accessible parking only in a VIP parking area upcharge, but not in the general admittance parking area general charge, and insist on the higher parking charge for all guests using accessible spaces?
Oh, an easy question. The answer is no. They can't do that. They if they were going to group, cluster, relocate, whatever you want to call it, the accessible spaces that are required in the lower price area, and they want to put them into the VIP area because it's closer to the entrance and it's better and everything, then they can charge the two different prices with it, even though they're kind of in the same area. They can say, well, these are VIP spaces and these are regular spaces because they really came from out there. That's a little awkward. A lot of places don't want to do that because it can be a little confusing to people. Why am I paying more or less or whatever than the person next to me? Or but you can't force people with disabilities to pay more than they should. If other people have an option, you park in the cheap area or the more expensive area, then people with disabilities need to have that same option.
Great. You noted that employers must provide parking accommodations to employees if necessary. Are universities required to do the same for students?
It depends. I think sometimes like in dormitories, in residential housing, particularly since the Fair Housing Act also would apply there. And if it would, sometimes parking is so fundamental to people being able to literally get in and out of places. When it comes to just having access to the general spaces on the campus, I think it is a little bit different. I mean, I think a university certainly wants to try to make sure that students with disabilities can get to their classes and their activities. But I think that they're at the same time, in most public facilities where you just go by a standard and you've met the standard, you can argue that you've met the standard and you're done. So I think that that is a really good question, and it's a really good thing to consider. I think a lot of post-secondary institutions do individualized things for students because if they're public institutions, then you also have the overarching obligation of Title II to ensure access to your programs and activities. And for a student who's probably paying a lot of money to have classes and activities and everything, you really want to make sure they can get to them. I sometimes encourage covered entities under either title. If you're finding that you have the minimum number of accessible spaces according to the standards, and it's not meeting the needs of your population, then I think you might want to consider adding, some accessible spaces. Add a couple and see how that goes. And, you really want to make sure, especially in a setting like that, that people can access your facilities and your programs. Really good questions.
Cindy, I see you have your hand up. Do you want to unmute and ask your question?
Jen, participants do not have the ability to use the mic during webinar.
Okay, someone else did. So Cindy, if you can type in your question in the Q&A or the chat, I'll try and get to it. Or you can always, again, give us a call or shoot us an email at the ADA Center. Let's see. Would the ADA cover elements of residential lots that are open to the public, like a leasing office? What about a pool or community room residents can rent and the public is allowed to join them at? Residential lots that have visitor spaces?
Any space in a private residential facility or community or something that's not covered by the ADA, any spaces that are used only by residents and their guests, the ADA doesn't reach those. Something like a leasing office where the general public goes would be covered by the ADA. Something like a party room or a swimming pool or something, if the housing entity actually rents out the space or sells memberships or something to the general public, that's going to trigger ADA coverage to that particular space and the parking that serves it or something. But if it's just the residents can reserve it or rent it or something for their own party, for their invited guests, that's not the general public. That residents and their guests are still Fair Housing Act. It's the general public that would potentially trigger Title III of the ADA. And again, thank you so much, everyone, for joining us. Here is our contact information. If you call the toll-free number 800-949-4232, and you'll get us if your phone number is from Delaware, District of Columbia, Maryland, Pennsylvania, Virginia, or West Virginia. If your phone number is based in some other area, you'll get some other folks who are just like us. And you can find us online at adainfo.org. So I don't know if we have time for one more question, maybe one more. I tried to answer a lot in the presentation, but I know it was a lot of information. So again, folks, do call us.
I'm going to pick an employment related one, of course. When you have an accessible parking space provided as an employee accommodation, how does this affect the total parking space count and the required number of accessible spaces?
Well, it generally isn't gonna really change that. And something that I should say about these employment accommodations or any place that you have these individualized accommodations is that they can change over time. Because people can come and go in those scenarios. So, I tend to recommend that you consider always making sure you're providing that minimum number especially if it's a shared lot and you want to make sure that your customers and your visitors and everything can get in. And really view that accommodation as a, as a separate issue. So with that, I know that there's probably a lot more questions out there. Call us, call your regional center, and sometimes we can sort through these real world scenarios a little more effectively when we can talk to you and have a conversation about a particular situation.
Thank you, Nancy. Thank you, everyone who participated today. We really appreciate it. And again, you'll see later on a link to access the recording on the website, and you already should have received the link. And I know they put it in the chat to access the slides. So thanks again to all of you. Thank you, Nancy, for a great presentation. I feel better equipped to answer questions about parking now, and I appreciate that on a personal level. And enjoy the rest of your day. Thanks, everyone.